milestone Statistical Office of Thailand as we prepare for the 2025 Population and Housing Census with April 1, 2025 designated as Census Day. For the first time, we are encouraging the public to respond online, aiming to reach as many people as possible across Thailand, 70 million residents. We are honored to have Statistics New Zealand, a globally recognized leader on census methodology and data quality, share their expertise with us today. Your insight will be invaluable as we work to ensure accurate, comprehensive, and timely population data for Thailand. I look forward to an engaging and productive discussion. Once again, thank you for your presence and welcome to today's section. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for welcome. I will introduce the Statistics New Zealand representatives, and then we will maybe kick into the agenda of presentation presentation, discussion. So that'd be great. So to my left, we have Nathaniel, who is a senior design analyst and has a lot to do with the 2023 census and the 2018 census and the introduction of administrative data into our census results. We have Andre, who's a statistical design analyst, and through 2023 was part of the methodological team and looked at imputation amongst other things. In our Wellington office, we have Alistair Ramsden, who is a senior design analyst, who is again part of the census methodology team for 2023, but also was part of the UNECE expert group that wrote the manual on how to create synthetic data. So you'll get first-hand experience and knowledge from him. As much as also Andre and Nathaniel. We also have Jonathan in the Wellington office, who is manager of census methodology. So he looked after some of the team that are presenting today. Is Amanda in the room or online?
She's not going to be here today. I'm sorry, Gary.
Okay, that's all right. And then finally, I'm Gary Dunner. I'm the Deputy Chief Methodologist here at Statistics New Zealand. And I've had nothing. I try and keep right out of the day-to-day running of the work, because we have great staff who do a lot of work, but I'm sort of responsible for the methodology and also how we interact with the subject matter areas and that with our census. So there we go. So over to Nathaniel and Andre in the first instance.
Great. Yeah, thanks for having us. It's always nice to be able to talk about what we've done and share that and hopefully be of some value. We do have some slides that I will talk to, but if there are sort of questions along the way, please feel free to interrupt me or put things in the chat or whatever's useful. We should have some time for discussion rather than us just talking at you the whole time. Alistair,
Okay.
Cool.
Yes.
Were you sharing the slides? Did you want to do that?
I can share the slide. Yeah. Share.
Yeah. Great. So, are you able to just make it full screen?
I'm going to try that.
Cool.
So I've just tried to share it as a slideshow, but I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong because it's not showing on the screen.
Just go off that, Alistair.
Yeah, if you just unshare and then you should be able to share that directly, I think.
Yeah.
I can start talking anyway as we go, and it's pretty big, so it's not a big deal. But yeah, so I'm going to talk mainly about what we've done with administrative data, and then particularly how we've used that in both our 2018 and 2023 censuses. And then, yeah, as mentioned, Alistair will talk about some of the synthetic data work later on.
If you just say,
if you go through, Alistair, and go through again. Yep, and again, actually, probably. So just for a little bit of background to begin with about the New Zealand population system, we run or have run a full enumeration census for a long time, and with a follow-up coverage survey to measure how well that is done, how many people that's missed or captured incorrectly. And then from that census, we produce our ongoing population estimates, which adjust for the error in that census count, and then are updated every quarter at a national level with births, deaths, external international migration estimates, and also annual population estimates by sort of geographic areas. Next slide. For a while, since 2012, we've been moving towards the greater use of different administrative data sources. So we've called this our census transformation strategy. And as you can see at the top here, it had two main goals from the start. So in the first place, that was modernizing our current census model, things like moving to online, things like starting to use some administrative data, and then had a longer term goal of investigating whether a census based primarily on administrative data would be feasible. That program has done a lot of research into the feasibility of that, mainly using this integrated data that I'll talk about in a little bit in a couple of slides, which contain different data sources across government. We have along the way released some sort of experimental estimates showing what could be done. And then in 2018 census, again, I'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but we ended up using that admin data a little bit more than we'd planned, but to a fairly successful extent. It's carried on, more research, more experimental outputs. 2023 census, a couple of years ago, the first one to incorporate the admin data, intentionally from the start by design. Next slide, please. I won't talk about this too much, but it was just some of the way we'd thought about the use of that administrative data in that transformation sense. So a lot of work went into this kind of understanding what those data sources looked like, what was available, and how well they might suit our statistical purposes. We know that a lot of data exists, but wanting to understand whether it would suit those purposes beyond its original purpose, what we might need to do with it, where we might need to do more. Next slide. And as part of that, we tried to consider a range of these different quality dimensions, how relevant it is to what we're trying to produce, that consistency over time, and then this big focus on accuracy. So comparisons against other data sets, how well does it actually align with what census might typically measure? And we've published quite a lot of information along the way about this sort of information, trying to really understand where and how it should be used. Next slide. So what we do have so if you maybe look at the right-hand side first, actually. So all of the use of administrative data at Statistics New Zealand is done through what we call this Integrated Data Infrastructure, or IDI. And this is a big database that we have which contains basically all of the key administrative and also survey data sets that we have here in New Zealand. We don't have a population register in New Zealand. We also don't have a national ID number, but we're able to produce a pretty reliable population or ever-resident population from some of the key data sources, which includes everyone that's born in New Zealand, everyone that pays tax, everyone that's migrated to New Zealand or has applied for a visa to live in New Zealand. And together that produces this ever-resident population, which is in that box, sort of in the middle there, upper middle. That contains about kind of 10 million people, compared with New Zealand's current population of about 5 million. So it goes back, includes people who might have left or died. We then link a lot of the other data sources to this. So we link in health data, we link in information from education, we've linked in some of the household surveys that we run. And this gives us a really, really valuable data set where everything is linked across sort of time, also across all of these different domains. And it's been really, really useful for us to do this development, to understand how we use this. We also have methods to take that 10 million people and to try to understand who's resident in New Zealand at a given point in time. So we call this that admin resident population, and essentially just looks at people who are active, people who might have paid tax, might have visited the doctor. It removes people who have died. It removes people who might have left to go overseas. We're pretty lucky that we're an island, pretty easy to determine who's come or gone. And on the next slide, we'll see that this population is pretty good. So we just go on, Elster. Thank you. It's a little bit hard to tell here, but basically this compares our administrative population against census and or our official estimates. And for the most part, they align pretty well. Pretty good evidence that admin data is useful for identifying this population. Next slide. Just was going to mention this briefly. One of the challenges that we do have is determining where people lived within New Zealand. So there's no strict requirement that when someone moves, they alert anyone, any government agencies. But we do have a lot of different sources that they'll collect this information to some extent. And what we've seen is that we don't get this sort of perfect. There are some challenges, particularly for that young adult age group. So this is showing how many people have the same or the correct address in admin data. Overall, we can do sort of about 90% of people correct, but yeah, a little bit worse for those younger populations that might move a bit more often. And this is really important for how we do build that population, how we get people in the right place. Next slide. This was just again showing that by having all of these different data sources, they do give us a wide range of information. So in some cases, we might have one really key data source for a piece of information. So to get the people who are studying, to get people's qualifications, we're relying basically on our education system. that information is going to be really reliable for that. For some other things like country of birth or again address, we have a wide range of data sources that contain that information, and collectively they can be quite good. Next slide. This one will be impossible to actually read, but what it's just trying to show is that all of these dots represent a different variable. Ones up in that top right-hand corner are variables that have been determined to be, or where admin data is considered to be highly reliable. We have things like age, like income, like again, country of birth. They're all really good. We're confident we can do that easily from admin data. Ones in the bottom left are ones where there basically is no administrative data available. Things like the languages people speak, or how people get to work, number of motor vehicles, some things that we just can't get through admin data. Next slide. Cool. So yeah, I'll jump into the what we've done, I guess, in our most recent censuses. I think. So we had a plan in 2018 census to run basically the traditional model that would run in New Zealand, but starting to move towards the use of admin data just a little bit. So we still went out and tried to get census responses from everybody, but we used admin data to understand or create where the dwellings were, to understand where to go to some extent for helping that field process. And we were also willing to use admin data in a small number of cases if we didn't get a census response to, again, the qualifications question. We might fill that in with administrative data. But it was always going to be reasonable. It was always planned to be reasonably minor in that use. As it turned out, our response rate was lower than, no, we'll go to that on the next slide. Just before I get ahead of myself, as it turned out, yeah, we got lower response rates than we had ideally wanted. And that made us reconsider that a little bit. So that low response rate was a little bit across the board, but also there were some particular subpopulations that were particularly difficult. And what we ended up doing was using that administrative data more directly to basically add records to the census file where they hadn't responded. And as part of this, we used some sort of statistical models to understand, or based off what we knew about that admin population, and trying to make sure we were using it in a way that made sense, used it sort of the right amount without pushing it too far. Next slide, Alice. Yeah. And I just noted here that we did that in 2018. I'll talk about it a little bit more in a second. For 2023, we ended up doing pretty much the same thing as where we ended up in 2018. So we did think that worked, that process for using admin data. All of the changes were reasonably small improvements where we had a little bit more time to refine what we were doing. Next slide. So just to kind of talk about what that looked like. So this is a representation of those two kind of key data sources that we had for that combined census in both 2018 and 2023. So on the left, this is a representation of the census responses that we went and collected. And we got, still quite a lot, if not as many as we'd wanted. And the point here is that where we get information from a census response, generally get all of the information. People answer every question on the form. And that's kind of the going across, if you imagine what that looks like. On the right-hand side, we have the admin population. And people, it's better coverage. Pretty much everyone is in that admin population. But it doesn't necessarily have all of the variables. Or those variables aren't always quite as good quality. Next slide. So the question was, how do we, make use of the information from both? And we linked this again, probabilistically. We don't have an ID number, so that's done off things like name, date of birth. Still works pretty well. And essentially the question we were asking was, what can we do about that bottom left sort of rectangle? People that are in the admin population, we're pretty confident live in New Zealand, but weren't picked up by census. So next slide. So the process we took was essentially asking which of those remaining admin people, so people in the admin population, not in census, should actually be added or included in our final census file. And we had a number of different sort of principles or ideas about how to do this, but ultimately came up with, here's a bit of a summary, that we wanted to include people when it was more likely than not, when we were pretty confident they both were genuinely in New Zealand, part of the New Zealand population at the time, and also that the address information from them was pretty reliable. And we wanted to make sure that we weren't gonna introduce any additional bias by including the wrong types of people or too many people in certain specific areas or particular populations. We had a two-phase approach to this. So we tried to put them into dwellings where we could. So in New Zealand, that was important for making sure that the quality of families and households, which we also get from census, were reliable. But there were cases in which we were willing, or if we weren't confident enough that we had a whole family, that we would just put this person in the file without attaching them to that specific household. Next slide. And I was just going to say, there's a few different scenarios we considered. This is just one example, looking at, again, those households. So we're able to say in our admin population, these 5 people all have the same address. We think they might belong together, they might live together. We had a statistical model that basically looked at how confident we were that those 5 people genuinely did live there, genuinely did live together. And on the right is basically just a rough indication of those probabilities. Households right on the right are ones where we were pretty confident they were correct. Ones to the left are much less sure. And essentially we said, if more confident than not, if you're further on the right side of that, we will happily put you into that household. And we could have made different decisions, but for our purposes, that was a pretty simple rule that did what we were looking for. Next slide. So yeah, I haven't gone into too much detail about those specific methods. They are probably reasonably specific to the New Zealand situation, but we do have have lots more information available, and we can certainly talk in more detail if and when it's useful. There's lots of numbers in that table on the right, and they won't all make that much sense immediately, but the general point here is that our final census file in both 2018 and 2023 consisted of about 89% census responses, and then another 11% coming from these admin records. So, reasonably sizable proportion coming from those additional records. Next slide. Oh, I do have a couple. So I thought I'd just include a couple of results to show what this kind of looks like. This is our final 2023 census counts by single year of age. The blue group at the bottom is the census responses we received, and then the other colours represent those admin records that get added. And the main point, I guess, here is that there are some populations that end up with slightly more admin records. Those, again, sort of young adults tend to have more need to fill those gaps than older age that are more like census responses. Similarly, on the next slide, it's probably so this is the ethnic groups that we have in New Zealand. And so, for example, the second and third bars there, in Pacific, which is important groups for New Zealand that we've sometimes struggled to find or get as high response rates from. That's sort of visible here, that the use of admin data means we're able to lift those populations up, whereas based only on census responses, they would have been a little bit lower than they should have been. So that's like the real value, I guess, we've seen in our admin processes, that it helps reduce the biases that we might have had otherwise. Next slide. So that was all about the population, essentially, like how do we count people at all. We also use different data sources for the specific attributes, be it the income that someone gets, or what ethnicity they are, or various other things. This range of different data sources in New Zealand. So when we get a census response, we use that. That's basically always the highest priority. We were willing to use previous census responses to fill in gaps in some cases. So that's particularly for variables where the information doesn't change much. Where someone was born, the country of their birth from 5 years ago, still going to be relevant for now. For others that do change, the type of occupation, the type of job someone's doing, we know that would change. So we don't use previous censuses there. We then look at the administrative data sources I've talked about. And that's, where they are, we know they are pretty good. And then we also have these statistical imputation processes that don't use specific information about the individual, are used to produce realistic distributions, which I'm going to talk about briefly before I...
Yes, more on statistical computation.
Next slide, sorry.
Yeah, next slide. So this is the final step with which we fill not all, but some of the gaps in the data. So the methods that things that Nathaniel's talked about until now, it will help sort of fill some of the gaps left over from census responses, but not all of them. And so we still have some gaps even after admin, but for some variables, for example, age, we require there to be 100% completion, i.e. coverage, i.e. no missing values. So to solve this problem, to complete these variables, we use a statistical model that predicts the missing values for a record. And it's not done for all variables, just some of them. To do this, we have a corporate tool that basically does pretty much all the statistical computation that StatsNZ needs to do, and this is called Census, which stands for Canadian Census Editing and Imputation System. So it was built by Stats Canada, the Canadian National Stats Office, and kind of delivered to us as a system, a tool that you can just apply to a census file. So this is a nearest neighbor donor imputation algorithm. So the idea is that if someone needs, the person that for which their records are being imputed is called the donee. So let's say that I am missing age. I didn't respond to my age in the census file, and we didn't find my age in admin data. It will go through this algorithm, will go through the file, it will look for other records that are similar to me, and then I will get that person's age. Now, the way it looks for most similar, i.e. a donor, is by looking at other variables in the census file for which we do have information. So maybe for age, you might use gender and address to determine a donor and impute the record. Next slide, please, Alistair. Going into a little bit more detail here, some work that we've done around statistical computation. How do we evaluate if the imputation we did was of good quality? Because if we're using an algorithm to generate data and then release it as census, we want to know that this is good quality data. The issue with when you're working with missing values is that you never know the true value of a missing census record. So to test Census, we have to use a form of simulated data. And this is kind of a first example of synthetic data that Alistair will be talking about later. But we create a test data set from the census data that we know the responses. And from this sliver of census data, we then remove some portion of the answers, therefore artificially creating missing values. And then you can use Census on this test data set that we've created, where we have missing values, but we know what their true original value was. So we can compare these true known values with what the data generated by Census is, and how often the imputed data agrees with the original data gives us a measure of imputation accuracy. We want good accuracy. High accuracy is great, but actually the main target for us when we're doing imputation is to preserve the expected distributions of values of attributes. So if you use Census to impute age, you don't want it to start introducing a skew in the data that will affect the counts of age. Because generally for census, we care a lot about our eventual aggregate counts. So while we do care about good accuracy when doing Census imputation, the evaluation of Census also consists of ensuring that these distributions are preserved post-imputation. And that is, I'll hand it back to Nathaniel for the last couple of slides.
Cool. Just go to the next slide, Alistair. I will just wrap up this section very quickly. This just showing kind of what that census file ends up looking like. So point again being that by adding in these admin records, this admin data, statistical imputation, we end up with more valuable information than we would have had just from the census responses, which are kind of that green bit at the top. Next slide is also representing the kind of different variables and just showing that we do have a different combination of sources, different levels of information in different cases. What is it? So, you know, the big blue census responses, red here is admin data, purple is that imputation. So for some variables, we can get there all from that admin. Others you end up relying on different combinations of data sources. And then just on the next slide, I think it's just kind of saying, we've found this a really valuable approach for us. We were in a pretty good position by having some of that research, but having to do it, actually doing it, we learned a lot more, and pretty happy that even though, you know, nothing going into that is perfect, there's limitations with census, there's limitations with admin data, there is real value in the final data that we've created by including all of this. And then just to point at the bottom that talking to others was really useful, so it's great that we can come and share this. And yeah, keen if you have any questions or if there's anything you'd like to discuss more or anything else at this point about what we've talked about or related things.
Thank you for sharing valuable presentation. I have a few questions from slide 11.
Cool.
As you mentioned, using administrative data, so I would like to know, how do you handle the challenges of integrating data from different data sources or different government agencies? For example, how do you deal with the different definition or ensure data compatibility across data sources?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So this is definitely one of the challenges, and a lot of what we have been doing is kind of the original assessment is looking at how well that information sort of aligns with the concept that we're typically trying to measure in census. So it's often been a kind of three-step approach. So yeah, if you just stay there, Alistair. So if we're looking at ethnicity, for example, which is sort of an important variable that we capture at Stats New Zealand. So the first part has been kind of looking at whether just what the agency says they are collecting aligns with what we're trying to collect. Is it that same concept? And generally at that stage, it sort of is. It's reasonably reliable. There's then a kind of second step, which is whether the counts or the distributions of those ethnicities align with what we see in our surveys. Do the same number of people say they are, as part of an ethnic group or not? And then there's also been the specific individual level comparisons. So where we do have linked data, and we can say that a given person has provided these values in their health information from a Ministry of Health, how well that aligns to what they've said in their census. And most of the sort of methods for us thus far have been kind of looking at that, seeing which source tends to be the most reliable, taking that as the highest priority. So we might decide that we use, again, health data where it's available, or if not, then we might go down to education, so on and so forth. There's some work about whether you could do it a little bit differently to that, but it has been kind of based off all of that kind of assessment in quite a lot of detail in some cases.
Can I also just add a quick answer that we also have data brokers and people who we make information requests. Sometimes if we hear about new data, and we work with that other government agency to add it to the IDI, and are continually trying to grow our data sources as well.
Yeah.
May I ask you some question about the combine the administrative data together and with the census data? So it means that do you collect the personal ID from the census, and what is the primary key that you use to combine the administrative data with the census data?
Yeah, we don't have a personal sort of key or ID in New Zealand. So we're reliant on other kind of identifying information, which is primarily name, date of birth, and potentially some information about their address. And so that's basically how all of our linking works. So sort of probabilistic methodology to see how well that aligns. It does make things a little bit more difficult, but we've kind of estimated that we can link sort of 98% of people or 97% of people pretty well to census. So it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. Yeah, and we just don't have any sort of keys that we can link on otherwise.
In Thailand, we have challenges with migrant workers and stateless individuals and people without official documentation. How does Statistics New Zealand handle imputation for those people?
I think this is one case where we're quite lucky in New Zealand, that for the most part, sort of everybody that's basically coming into New Zealand, again, because we're like an island, we have pretty much perfect information about who's coming into the country, and it means that they are, for the most part, going to be in some of our administrative sources. There inevitably is like a little bit of challenge around certain populations, whether that or people who are kind of don't have a permanent address. But yeah, I think we're quite lucky that it's much less of a challenge for us.
Because maybe using census to imputation the missing value from the census also. So we would like to ask you about the challenges of using CANSI and how do we preparing the data for can size before imputation?
Yes. Well, so the way we did can size was we split it into modules. So for the individual variables, basically information about a person must be, I'm guessing, about 20 odd variables required imputation. And what we did is we set up the data to split it so that it was done in different blocks, where each block imputed a category of variables. So we have census file web apps that mostly looking okay, and then one we set it up so it's going to impute age, gender, and then in block 2 and was address. In block we had it set up to impute things like ethnicity and whether you're studying or not. And then block 5 we set it up to impute variables around working. If you're employed, your income sources. And their blocks run sequentially one after the other. So first you impute age, gender, etc., so that you've got those complete variables. You then use that complete information to impute, so that you've got more information to impute the next ones, like address. Then you've got imputed address. As you go on, your data gets more and more and more filled up, and so then by the end, that's one of the things that we did to impute, to run can size. It's also we found that can size requires a lot of work just to get it in the right data in the right format that it can process the information, the data that goes through it correctly. I don't know how much you guys have done on that front. I know that from our end, it required a lot of setting up. And even while running it during the statistical development process, there were a few bugs here and there that kept propping up and maybe creating some unexpected results that we had to fix. So expect something like that to happen if you're working with can size.
Is can size, have you used can size or some similar tool in Thailand before?
This is our first time decided to use the can size for the imputation process. So now we are try to study from the document that we received from the Stat Canada.
I think we also sent across our paper on how we did editing and imputation as well, so you can refer to that too.
In 2010, we used the hot deck method for the imputation.
Can size is a hot deck method, is it not, Andre?
It escapes me exactly what hot deck means, but I believe yes. Yeah. You're using data from the data set itself to fill in the gaps, which I think is what that's me. Yeah.
Hot deck is imputation is mean like we use the nearest neighbor imputation, but it may be not effective like a nearest imputation method. But we use the same characteristic of people to impute data by using hot deck imputation.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, can size is pretty effectively does do that. It's set up to handle like doing that for a big data set, which is good.
Wait a minute, we need to translate the question from Thai to English.
That's one slide explaining how you use the three sources of the information, one from census and administrative data, and the other source called match block.
Oh,
Can you explain more about the match block? Not this one.
no,
No.
no, no.
No. So it might have been talking about the so the mesh block part is
Oh, I know.
Yeah, this one.
yeah.
Not this one.
Yeah. One of the graphs maybe. 22 or 23.
No, not this
No. Oh, yes. These ones.
This one, yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes. So when I was talking about the kind of two different phases of our adding admin people in, this is kind of what the yellow versus red, or the dwelling versus mesh block, means here. So where we're saying we can add them into a dwelling, that basically means, yeah, that whole combination of people, we're confident they live together in this specific dwelling, so we put them in with sort of the most detailed information. Mesh block, on the other hand, is it's the smallest geographic area in New Zealand. So it means that sort of population of about 100 people in a given mesh block, so pretty small. And basically this just means we've added someone to the census file. We think they live, roughly here, but we're not quite confident enough in that whole combination of people, that whole household type information. And so they don't have a specific, address dwelling as part of that record, basically. So they'll contribute to our total counts, but not to those households. So yeah, it's just kind of a level of detail of how confident we were, essentially. It's, yeah, reasonably, probably again, things that's somewhat specific to our New Zealand case. And, you know, in a perfect world, we wouldn't have any of these records because they're not quite as useful, but it was a bit of a compromise.
I would like to confirm about my understanding about mesh block in your country, because Thailand using enumeration area that
Yeah.
we divided the region or the province to be a small geographic area to collect the data of census. So it's mean it's a mesh block from your country is like a EA in Thailand or not?
I think very similar in that, yeah, it's a statistical unit, basically a really small statistical unit. Yeah.
I have a question. How many people typically, on average, are in an EAA?
It's approximately 350 households living in the EA.
Okay, maybe in a mesh block we might have 100 or 75 or 120 or lower numbers than that.
Yeah, a little bit smaller, but kind of similar purpose.
Yeah.
Mesh blocks are normally 50 to 60 dwellings.
Yeah.
So a population of 150 to 200-ish, or thereabouts.
Yeah, so my version of a mesh block enumeration, which Nathaniel might wince at for how simplified this is that if we couldn't, through our admin data algorithms and coding, identify that they probably belonged in a household, an administrative household at a specific address, and we still want to make sure that the census unit record file, we probably knew that they're at that household, but we didn't feel comfortable putting them into the actual households. We knew they're at the address, but not the household, so we called it a mesh block enumeration and enumerated them to the overall mesh block associated with that address. So yeah, it was sort of like a way of catching additional people we wanted to use in the census file without specifically putting them into a particular household if we didn't feel comfortable actually physically related to the people who were at that household. Yet we still had billing related or tax records or so forth telling us they're at that address, yet we didn't feel comfortable that they were a brother or a sister or an aunt or an uncle or something that actually was related to the other people who were certain of being at that household.
I should add that I think one of the primary reasons that we were quite focused on the admin enumeration and the mesh block is for one of the purposes of the census file is to create the electoral boundaries for our voting system. And so we sort of want each electorate to be roughly the same size so that everyone's vote is proportionally the same. So we want to make sure that we do get people in the right rough area so that when we create the electoral boundaries, we have a well-distributed government and representation so that, you know, we take all the mesh blocks and then we slice them up into the number of seats that we have in the electoral system. So that was one of the key drivers, because that is a key output from our census. So, so the census is not just about population counts, but it's about, you know, one of the key uses is our electoral system, so good for a good democracy.
It does sound to me like mesh blocks in New Zealand and EAAs in Thailand are similar concepts, that they're a low-level geographic disaggregation of the area.
Yeah. Before we finish this section, can I just go back to the Census person who wanted some tips on how to use Census? One tip that we had that worked well for us on doing Identify was this: that at one point we had 2 experts working on it, and that meant that if there was redundancy, if we had requests, there was someone away, the other person would step in, and they were kind of able to learn and grow together. So it provided us with a learning platform and developing it together. So one kind of thought that I'd have for you is, don't just put it onto one analyst and make them the expert. Maybe have at least a dual kind of team of at least 2 or 3 people working on it so they can trade notes, and you have redundancy there and coverage if something happens.
One more question about the mesh block. Is it the information in mesh block is dwellings or residences?
So when we're talking about so a mesh block will have maybe 40 dwellings, 100 people. When we're talking about these admin enumerations, it's finding a person and saying that person lives in the mesh block. Was that the question?
Yeah, well, the question is, how do you, like, the unit inside the mesh block, is it dwellings or a person?
In this case, we're talking about admin enumerations as people.
So it's
There are dwellings. Yeah, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I understand the question. So in mesh blocks, the primary subset in the mesh block is dwellings, but where we can't place people in dwellings, we'll just place people directly into a mesh block, and those people don't have a dwelling.
I have no more questions for this presentation.
Okay, great. I think we're ready for Alistair to present.
Yes, just that, if there is more detailed information about this, we've got plenty that would be happy to share. So if there are follow-ups.
Off you go, Alistair.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Nathaniel and Andre. So I'm going to talk about synthetic data methods. I'm going to cover 5 areas. First thing is kind of an introduction. What is synthetic data? How does it relate to confidentiality or statistical disclosure control? What are its benefits? The second is to show you some examples of one variable or multiple variable synthetic data methods, particularly what's called the fully conditional specification method, and then how can we extend that method to as many variables or categories as you want. And I'm then going to have some examples of synthetic data output in practice from Stats New Zealand, and then I have at the end of the presentation some links to resources that describe synthetic data and various and other elements related to synthetic data. So this is a definition of statistical confidentiality from a book published in 2011 by George Duncan and his colleagues. I think he's a university professor in Vancouver in Canada. And he says, so what exactly is statistical confidentiality? Simply put, it is the stewardship of data to be used for statistical purposes. Stewardship, as expressed in statistical confidentiality, is an active embrace of responsibility for both protecting data and ensuring its beneficial use, its good use. Explicitly, it requires proper practices for both providing and restricting access to data products. And synthetic data is a method for producing outputs that have good statistical confidentiality. There's a range of different definitions, but if we look at the Rubin definition here, Don Rubin wrote a paper in the Journal of Statistics in 1993, which is considered the first statistical paper on synthetic data, and it talks about inferentially valid, confidentialized public use microdata. It's important to understand that there's a difference between dummy data, so that's data that doesn't have any claim to represent the real world, and statistically valid synthetic data, which does. Both are potentially useful, but in different circumstances. I like this quote from physicist Richard Feynman about how it really talks to how statistically valid synthetic data works. The physicist has meaning to all their phrases. In physics, you have to have an understanding of the connection of words with the real world, and statistically valid synthetic data retains meaningfulness. It retains the inferential validity about what's been documented in statistics, even though it has confidentiality applied to it. And this also needs to be communicated to users with metadata that describe what is retained in the synthetic data. And I'll skip over that. So in the general statistical business process model, there's two main areas where we would use synthetic data. One is for testing, and the other is for output. So where we apply disclosure control and then output to users and customers. And for testing, we might use dummy data, and we might also use statistically valid synthetic data. But when we output data, we're only outputting statistically valid synthetic data. Okay. Benefits. So benefits are that if we provide users with metadata, then we can produce statistics for them to use safely, meaning in ways that aren't going to lead to a confidentiality breach or privacy harm. Right, so let's look at some examples. So here's an example of a typical method. We have our original counts or weights, which we will sum and then put through a confidentiality process. And then we have sums, which are perturbed counts or weights, which we can then turn back into synthetic counts or weights. And this is the data we normally hold securely. That this might be your original census responses, which you turn into statistics. And then this is the statistics, once you've confidentialized them, that you then publish. Here's another example of the same thing, where you have a set of unit records with variable values. So these are categorical variables and counts or weights, which then get summed into category sums, put through a confidentiality process, which ends up with data that you can publish, but then it can also be turned back into unit record data. And here's another example of that with some simple categorical variables. So for instance, in this original data here, we have one small red triangle and two small red squares and so on. But through the confidentiality process, we will perturb those counts. So in this case, we'll output that there are no small red triangles and 3 small red squares, which can then be turned back into a unit record data set, which looks a lot like the original, but is different, and so has uncertainty. And it's that injected uncertainty that gives you the confidentiality in either the unit record set here or the output sums. We have a general method for use for synthetic data in Stats New Zealand, and a lot of it is about ensuring that whatever we produce is fit for purpose. We need to know what the objective of the product is and who the users are, and then consider the use and the safety of what we produce, and does it align with our standard policies and our confidentiality rules. Here's an example of a case study. This was a pilot project, I think back in 2019. We've talked about the integrated data infrastructure where we have about 10 million records. So in this Population Explorer product, we took a sample of about 100,000 records, and we used a synthesis method to model that sample. So this was the original data, this was the synthetic data, and we tested this data for utility and safety. And when we were comfortable with that, we released it as an internal by researchers, and we released it to how can we test the utility and safety of synthetic data? I was involved with the production of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe Synthetic Data for Official Statistics, a starter guide. And in that, there's a chapter on disclosure, so that's the safety part. And there was a chapter on utility measures. And in that book, there's a decision tree for what kind of disclosure control you might need for data, depending on what you're going to do with it. And then there was also a section on that you might want to use. But again, this is all dependent on what is your objective, who are you using. You have to tailor the method that you use for synthesis to what your output's going to be. Now, we can extend this method to as many variables or categories as we want. Using a modeling, so some can be derived using models, and they can be developed to meet customer needs. Excuse me. So each single variables synthesis needs a probability distribution model, and then use random numbers to allocate results into the synthetic data. Let's go on to here. So this is a general build, and you build a random number vector and then you take a subset of your original data source, you then synthesize using the probability distribution table of that subset and the random number vector. And then you can do that multiple times with different subsets of your original data source. And then you join the index and those output synthetic data vectors together as a population table P. Then you can calculate the utility and safety metrics comparing the original data and the synthetic data. And if these metrics are acceptable, you can then release that synthetic data. But if not, then you sometimes have to go back and say, oh, we didn't get the results we expected. Either the data isn't useful enough or it isn't safe enough. And so you end up having to go back and iterate through your process and tinker with your method until you get the results that you're seeking in terms of safety and utility. When you release the data, you need to make sure it's in a good data format and has variable names and has good metadata describing what the statistical validity or inferential validity of that synthetic output set is, because only the retained inferential validity is of use. If people use that data for other means or other methods, then they could end up with completely wrong results. What acceptable safety and utility metrics are is to some extent arbitrary, but it seems appropriate to be guided by local laws and regulations and international guidelines and norms. For instance, confidentiality best practice, including differential privacy. Some examples. So 2018 census and 2023 census output tables are substantively identical to synthetic data. What we use in those outputs is we use random rounding to base 3 of a particular kind, which is a constant for a given output over different outputs. And we also use suppression of small counts where the count output is less than 6. We also are building or have built synthetic data for various other work projects, such as at the moment I'm looking with colleagues at building synthetic data for consumer price index testing. And we have some other synthetic data outputs where in the New Zealand grid geography project, we took census population and disaggregated it into 1 kilometre grids and then also into 250 metre grids. So these are very highly granular geographic disaggregation of the population. We also built a synthetic population for the Heara Potama Moterera Maori project, which is a project that took that synthetic data set as an input, and then it was used with various proposed interventions to test whether those interventions would be successful in increasing the uptake of the New Zealand Indigenous language Te Reo Maori. And Stats New Zealand has been producing synthetic data outputs for some time, back to at least 2008. This is an example of the population grid geography output. So each of these, this is population density in New Zealand, and each of these columns will be a square kilometre. Or maybe slightly bigger, I suspect, by the looks of that. But as you can see, New Zealand has some areas of high population density and lots of areas of low population density. This is an example of an output from the Heara Potama Te Reo Maori project, where it disaggregates by geography and then by ethnicity, whether someone is Maori or non-Maori, and then the proportion of those people that speak Te Reo Maori. And this project had to go through that iterative method that the first time that they ran the synthetic data for this population, some of the very sparsely populated areas in the South Island were not meeting the safety threshold, that the safety metric wasn't being met. And so what they did was they joined up our standard statistical areas together. They aggregated those areas to make the data a little bit less accurate, but then it passed the metrics that we were interested in. Okay. And then these are a series of, I've got 2 pages of reference documents. The synthetic data for official statistics, that's the guide from UNECE that I had I contributed to. This balancing access and confidentiality, the role of synthetic data in official statistics, that's the UN SCAP presentation that I think I met Tawasep. Is it Tawasep? Tawasep?
Carolina Costa.
Yeah, sure. Anyway, that's how we ended up. Tawisap, sorry. That's how we ended up getting in contact with each other, was that we presented together at that presentation. There's a link to the general statistical business process model and some kind of introductory articles and books about synthetic data. Both Don Rubin and George Dreschler's book are really good. And then, here we go. There's more information about synthetic data, including links to the RSynthPop package. So there's RSynthPop is a good package that can be used to productionize synthetic data outputs. And Gillian Raab here was one of the authors of the synthetic data for official statistics document. And then also some general statistical confidentiality links, including the algorithmic foundations of differential privacy, which is a really good book on how to think about and implement differentially private systems. And this towards a principled framework for disclosure avoidance was only very recently published by the US Census Bureau. They held a seminar yesterday, which one of our colleagues attended, and the paper's very clear in terms of a principles-based approach for developing confidentialization systems. Okay. So that's my presentation.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have one question. Our National Statistical Office, we has never used synthetic data before. So for currently, we have 86,000 households for our survey. So if we use synthetic data, can we scale up to 24 million households?
Yes, so you're saying that you sample 86,000 households out of 24 million? Is that right?
For our sample survey, we have 86,000 households. So we would like to scale up to 24 million households in Thailand.
No, I don't understand what you're meaning. Do you mean for the census you will sample 24 million households? Or do you want to take the sample of 86,000 households and then use that to represent the 24 million households somehow?
Yes, Alistair, that's what I mean, is that they've got a sample,
Yeah.
survey that's got 86,000, but they wanted to represent 24 million. But
yes,
using synthetic data. Yep.
the answer would be similar to the proposed Census survey approach that some of our colleagues did back in 2015 that has been recently circulated, again through our team work. The issue becomes you need to put confidence intervals and sample error metrics on your outputs, because if you're taking a sample of 86,000 households out of 24 million, I think that's what I'm hearing, then you're going to end up having sample error. So you're going to end up saying, this is our mid estimate, our point estimate, but because of our sample is quite small, we have to also say 95% of the time the actual number is going to be within that number plus a value or minus a value. So you might say of the 24 million households, a million do whatever one thing, whatever arbitrary category you're interested in describing about them, but actually the value might be between 900,000. That's standard methodology.
Are you asking as well if you can use synthetic data on the other, 23 point something million? Is that the question?
Yes, I asked synthetic data methodologies can be scaled up from samples.
Yeah. They use synthetic data on the other 23 million.
Well, synthetic data won't improve the data quality. It's what you're doing there is you're going to end up making an assumption that the 24 million households are like the 86,000 households, which if you're using a stratified sample, then you would be able to do that within a normal or Gaussian statistical method, but it won't improve the data quality of your sample.
Mm. Good answer.
I think I can stop sharing this, can't I?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's one more questions about how to use the synthetic data. Do you use the synthetic data and then anonymize the data for dissemination, or do you use synthetic data for filling missing information?
For the first one, for thing. So data is a confidentiality technique or a statistical disclosure control technique. It won't improve the quality of the data, and if you plugged synthetic data back into a process, then only the inferential validity that's retained in the synthetic data will be useful. So you have to be very careful. Like I say, you have to be very careful with providing users of synthetic data metadata, and to not use the synthetic data as a statistical input for things that it doesn't retain the statistical validity for.
Yeah, so Alistair, was synthetic data actually used for testing in the census 2023?
That's right, yes. And it's been used for testing in 2018 census as well. So synthetic data is perfectly good as dummy data to be used for testing, but care needs to be taken if your synthetic data as a statistical input.
Yeah, we chose not to use synthetic data in our unit record files or the actual substance of our census outputs. As Alistair says, we actually used it for testing our processing system, testing our results, and testing our processes. So all the other things we used was what Andre and Nathaniel said earlier about using administrative data to fill in missing attributes, using imputation. So I guess, how strong is your administrative data? Is it in a strong shape for you to be able to plug in the missing gaps in your 23 million that you have apart from the 86,000? How is your administrative data?
So what if the TNSO, we would like to know if we use synthetic data for filling the missing information. What do you think about this method?
No, I wouldn't recommend that. No. You could use it to output the data that you've got. How can I say? What am I trying to say? So for your census, you're going to have a census survey, and you'll have administrative data as well, and you'll combine that data together. That's kind of what we've done for our census. Then that's the input to a synthetic data confidentialization process, and then the output is what you release to the public. Now, it could be that what you do is you say, based on what we've got in our census inputs, we want to create a whole population of Thailand, which we then disaggregate by age and sex and whatever other categorical variables you're interested in. But at the point that you do that, when you're doing that synthesis, one of the things you would need to do would be to put error bounds or sample errors around it to say this is how accurate or inaccurate the results are.
Awesome.
If you used it to generate a unit record population, I'm not sure that it would be a very accurate unit record population.
Yeah. So to summarize Alice's answers, we recommend against using synthetic data to plug your gaps in your census data. We would recommend using administrative data if your administrative data quality is strong, and or using imputation size as your backup. With our prioritization of our data sources, we had census respondents first. People respondents. Our next ranked quality of data was the administrative data, and then our third ranked was imputation, and we put them in that precedential order. And I would not put on that list synthetic data for plugging gaps. It's more for testing, I think, is probably the most popular use, as Alistair mentioned.
Well, it's either testing or confidentiality, applying confidentiality
Sure.
for output. Yeah.
May I have one question about the synthetic data? This question from my colleagues who participating in this meeting. He would like to know about how do you check the data quality when you finish the synthetic data method?
Mm-hmm. There's a range of different utility measures. Maybe I'll put the slide up again. Hang on a sec. Yeah. Share. So if we look in this synthetic data for official statistics book, there's a range of specific utility measures. Now, what we have used in the past, we've used we've investigated the Kullback-Leibler divergence, which is the same thing as the Jensen-Shannon divergence. So what that is it takes the probability distribution of the original data and compares it to the probability distribution of the synthetic data and generates a metric, more or less the smaller, I think it's the smaller the metric, the more accurate they are. So meaning that if you look at the distribution of the original data compared to the distribution of the synthetic data, and they are similar, then you'll get a small metric value. But if they're quite different, then you'll get a larger one. Also, in our outputs for census, when we use our confidentiality method, all the counts results are only ever varied using perturbation or rounding by plus or minus, maximum of plus or minus 2. So any counts output that we output, it's a very close value compared to the original value, but we also suppress small counts. So we use what's called k-anonymity as a method, which is one of the methods here that's described here. We've investigated differential privacy as a method. Now these are safety methods, but substantively outputs from 2023 census are very accurate because, like I say, because any count that isn't suppressed is within plus or minus 2 of the original count.
I think we have no more questions, and today's meeting it's very constructive. We got a very great recommendations from Statistics New Zealand, and it would be great if you could send the presentation to us on email. Is it okay for that?
Yes.
If you can share the presentation.
Definitely do that. Yeah.
Okay, and as you know, we are kicking off the 2025 population and housing census on April 1st. And we might ask for some more advice along the way. If it's okay for you that we contact you through email or arrange the short meetings just like this during our census, is it possible to do that?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite the director, Nong Lak, to give a few ending speech.
Thank you, Statistics New Zealand, for an insightful and engaging session. Your expertise and census methodology, imputation, and synthetic data reflect true professionalism and a commitment to statistical excellence. The knowledge shared today will help us strengthen data accuracy and reliability in Thailand census effort. We deeply appreciate your support and look forward to continued collaboration. Thanks also to my colleagues at NSO Thailand for your active participation. Let's take this insight forward and apply them to our work. Thank you and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank you
very
for your
much.
time. Bye bye. Have a
Okay.
great day. Bye bye.
Yeah.